The wind blew hotly across the Wild West plains, carrying the scent of dry earth and the distant murmur of the river winding between the hills. It was a night like so many others in the small town of Redemption Creek, where time seemed to stand still, and the stars shone with an intensity known only to the open skies of the countryside. But tonight, something was different. There was an urgency in the air, a tension that hung over the two bodies at the water's edge, where the moonlight reflected in small silver flashes. He was a cowboy, a man of few words but profound gazes. His hat, worn by sun and wind, cast a shadow over his face marked by the scars of a hard life. His hands, calloused from working with cattle and the grip of his pistol, trembled slightly as they held hers. She, in turn, was the blacksmith's daughter, a woman of quiet strength, whose brown eyes held more secrets than the words she dared speak. Her simple cotton dress fluttered in the breeze, as if even the fabric knew this moment was special. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her fingers gripping his with a strength that betrayed the fear she was trying to hide. "Stay. The land is not your battle." He looked toward the horizon, where the shadows of the mountains merged with the darkness of the night. There was something in his eyes she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of determination and something that felt very much like farewell. "It's not for the land," he replied, his voice hoarse as the aged leather of his saddle. "It's because of what it represents, for the freedom to choose how to live, without shadows haunting us." She knew what he was talking about. The shadows were many, his past, full of choices that had left him a wanted man, her future, uncertain, tied to a city that offered nothing but dust and memories. But that night, by the river, none of that mattered. What mattered was the here and now, the touch of their hands, the warmth of their bodies almost melting together, as if they were trying to hold on to each other's memories that time could erase. "What if you don't come back?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, filled with a fear she didn't want to admit. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he released her hands and knelt at the water's edge, scooping up a handful of damp sand. He let the grains slide between his fingers, as if weighing the weight of his own words. "I will be back," he said finally, standing up and taking her face in his hands again. "But if life goes faster than me, promise me you won't wait forever. Promise me you'll live, even if it's without me." She wanted to protest, to say that she would never be able to go on without him, that her heart beat in time with the hooves of his horse. But the words died in her throat. Instead, she just nodded, feeling tears burn the corners of her eyes. "Wait for me here," he continued, pointing to the river, where the water flowed slowly, as if he also knew that this moment was sacred. "Wait where the sun sets and the waters still shine. I will return before the river runs dry." She laughed, a fragile sound that was lost in the wind. "The river never dries up," he said, as if this were an absolute truth. He smiled, a rare gesture that lit up his tired face. "So there is nothing to fear," he replied, before leaning in and kissing her with an intensity that seemed to want to save all the kisses that were yet to come. When he pulled away, she tasted the salty tears mixed with the sweet taste of his lips. He mounted his horse, a beast as black as the night, and looked at her one last time. There were no more words. They weren't necessary. Between them, there was only silence laden with promises and the distant sound of the river, a silent witness to an oath that fate might or might not honor. She stood there watching as he walked away, his silhouette blending into the darkness until it disappeared completely. Only then did she allow the tears to fall freely, wetting the earth where her feet were firmly planted. There was no doubt in her heart. She would wait. She would wait for the sound of his footsteps, the sparkle in his eyes when he saw her again, for the fulfillment of a promise made under a starry sky that seemed to hold all the world's secrets. And so, by the river that never dried, she began her vigil. She didn't know how long it would take, nor what the future held. She only knew that as long as there was water running between those banks, there would be hope. And as long as there was hope, she would be there, waiting for the return of the man who had taken her heart with him. The days that followed that night were like a fever dream, a sequence of mornings that dawned with blazing sun, and nights that fell with an unbearable weight on her shoulders. The town of Redemption Creek continued its routine, indifferent to the pain gnawing at the blacksmith's daughter's chest. Men still gathered in the saloon at dusk, children played in the dusty streets, and women whispered gossip as they hung their laundry on the line. But for her, the world had stopped. Time, which once flowed like the waters of a river, now dragged on, each second stretching like a shadow in the late afternoon. He was gone, taking with him not only his presence but also the sense that the future could be different. Now only emptiness remained, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow even the simplest sounds. The bird's song, the horse's clop, the children's laughter. In the first few weeks, she still woke hoping it was all a nightmare. She opened her eyes and for a moment imagined he would be beside her, that his body heat would still warm the covers. But reality was cruel. His side of the bed was cold, and the smell of leather and smoke that always accompanied him had dissipated, replaced by the dry odor of dust drifting in through the open window. She rose before dawn, as she always had, but now her movements were mechanical, as if her body knew what to do, even if her mind was lost in a fog of longing. She made coffee, helped her father in the forge, smiled at the customers who came to pick up horseshoes or repair plows. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a mask, a facade that hid the turmoil within her. The river, once a place of gathering, of laughter and promises, became her refuge. Every afternoon, after work at the forge was finished, she would walk to the bank, sit on the same rock where he had knelt that night, and stay there, staring at the water that flowed unhurriedly, as if time had no power over it. Sometimes she would close her eyes and try to hear his voice, its husky timbre telling her he would return. Other times, she would dig her fingers into the damp sand, as if she could hold on to something that had already slipped away. The river, however, gave her no answers. It simply flowed on, indifferent to her pain, as if it knew some things were beyond human control. Rumors began to swirl around town like a warm wind before a storm. At first they were just whispers. The cowboy had been seen in Lincoln County, involved in a saloon brawl. Then came the darker stories. He had joined an outlaw gang, crossing the border into Mexican territory, where the law did not reach and violence reigned. Some said he was dead, shot by a sheriff in some distant town, his body left for the vultures. Others swore they'd seen him in El Paso, drunk and playing cards, as if he'd never had anyone to come home to. She listened to everything, but didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The words of others didn't change the truth she carried in her heart. He had promised to return, and she believed it. But doubt, like a weed, began to sprout in her mind. What if he didn't return? What if the promise was just a way to soften the goodbye? What if, somewhere beyond those mountains, he had already forgotten her? People began to look at her with pity. The women of the town, who had previously envied her for having won the heart of a man like him, now whispered behind her worn dress. "She's waiting for a ghost," some said. "One day, he'll show up with another one on his arm," prophesied others. Even her father, a man of few words and a hard heart, tried to convince her to move on. "Life doesn't stop, daughter," he said one night, as he wiped the soot from his hands after a long day of work. "You can't be stuck in a shadow." She didn't argue. No argument could shake her faith. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, even she began to question her own certainty. The river, which never ran dry, seemed lower. The rains, which had once fallen regularly, became rare, and the sun burned the earth with relentless intensity. It was as if nature, too, was waiting, holding its breath until something changed. One afternoon, as she sat by the water, a strange man rode into town. He rode a thin horse, and his hat, worn and dusty, hid half his face. He stopped at the saloon, ordered a whiskey, and began asking questions. "Do you know a cowboy who passed through here a few months ago? Tall, light eyes, scar on the chin?" Her heart raced when she heard the description. It was him. It had to be. But when the stranger continued speaking, her hope turned to ash. "I heard he was involved with some dangerous men," said the stranger, lowering his voice as if he feared being overheard. "They say he betrayed the gang. If that's true, he's probably no longer alive." She felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. It wasn't the first time she'd heard something like this. But this time, the man's words carried a different weight. There was something in his tone, a certainty that frightened her. She got up and left the saloon without a word, her legs trembling, her breath shallow. She walked to the river as she always did, but this time, instead of peace, she found only a greater emptiness. She sat on the rock and buried her face in her hands, letting the tears fall uncontrollably. For the first time since he'd left, she allowed herself to doubt. What if he really wouldn't come back? What if it was all just an illusion, a dream she refused to let go of? The wind blew hard that night, as if trying to carry away her tears. She looked up at the sky, where the stars shone cold and distant, and felt a loneliness so profound it seemed to swallow everything around her. The river continued to flow, indifferent. The city continued to live, indifferent. And she, once again, was alone. But still, she didn't move. She remained there, at the water's edge, as if her body had become part of the landscape, because deep down, it didn't matter what others said, or what time or fate had in store. She had made a promise, and as long as there was a glimmer of hope, she would keep waiting. Even if silence was her only companion. Even if the whole world told her to give up. Because some promises are stronger than fear. Some loves are stronger than death. And she, more than anything, knew that as long as her heart beat, he could still return. Even if he was just a shadow by the river. Even if he was just an echo of everything they had once been. The river had always been there, long before she was born. Long before he arrived at Redemption Creek with his black horse and his eyes filled with unlived storms. The waters flowed slowly, as if carrying the weight of all the stories they had ever witnessed. The vows of lovers, the tears of mothers who lost sons to war, the sighs of men who set out in search of fortune and never returned. The river was the living memory of that arid land, the only witness that never lied, that never tired of repeating the same truths to anyone who would listen. And she learned to listen. In the first months after his departure, the river was her solace. She went to the bank every afternoon, after the sun began to lose its fury, and the shadow of the mountains stretched over the water like a protective mantle. She sat on the same rock, where the sand still bore the mark of his knees that night, and talked. She spoke softly, as if afraid someone would hear her, but also as if she knew the river would not repeat its secrets. She told of the day she had had, of her father's harsh words, of the pitying looks of the townswomen. Sometimes she laughed to herself, remembering something he had said, a gesture, a look. Other times she cried, and the tears fell into the water, dissolving as if they had never been. But the river wasn't just a confidant. It was also a silent judge. As the months passed, the waters began to recede. The drought arrived slowly, like a disease that eats away at the bones without anyone noticing. At first, there were only small puddles of mud where the current had once been strongest. Then the rocks that had been submerged began to appear, covered in a white crust of salt. The fish that once leaped to the surface at dusk disappeared. The birds that had come to drink from those waters left, seeking other places where life still pulsed. And she, who had always thought the river was eternal, began to understand that nothing lasts forever. The townspeople were talking. The river is drying up, they said, as if it were something new. It is God's punishment for men's greed, the older women murmured, making the sign of the cross. "It's just another drought like so many others," the men in the saloon shrugged, playing cards and drinking whiskey as if the world weren't changing around them. But for her, the drought wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was an omen, a warning, as if the river, tired of waiting, was retreating, taking with it the last hopes that it would return. She began to dream of water. She dreamed she was drowning, that the cold waters of the river were pulling her under. And when she looked up, she saw his face, distorted by the current, calling out to her. She woke gasping, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst her ribs. Other times she dreamed the river had dried up completely, and where the water had once flowed, there was only a desert of white stones, where fish bones gleamed in the sun like warning signs. On those nights, she would get up and go to the bank, just to make sure there was still water. Even if it was just a trickle, even if it was just mud. As long as there was some, she could keep hoping. But the drought was unforgiving. As the weeks passed, the riverbed grew wider and wider, emptier and emptier. The banks, once covered in reeds and wildflowers, were now bare, exposed like open wounds. The smell of damp earth gave way to the smell of dust, of dead things. And she, who had always found comfort in this place, began to feel as if the river were abandoning her, as if even it had given up on faith. One day, as she sat on the rock, her feet sinking into the remaining mud, an old Indian woman came up to her. She wasn't from Redemption Creek. No one knew where she came from. But she sometimes appeared nearby, selling herbs and telling stories no one understood. The old woman looked at the river, then at her, and her dark eyes shone as if she had seen something the others couldn't. "You wait for someone," said the old woman, not as a question, but as a statement. Her voice was harsh, like dry leaves being crushed. She didn't answer. There was no need. The old woman already knew. "Water doesn't lie," continued the Indian woman, pointing to the river with a gnarled finger. "She takes what is no longer needed, and keeps what must be remembered. But when she dries up, it's because she's tired of waiting." She felt a chill run down her spine. These weren't just words. It was a truth she already felt, but didn't want to admit. "What if he doesn't come back?" he asked, his voice so low it was almost lost in the wind. The old woman smiled, a sad gesture that seemed to carry centuries of pain. "So the river will have dried up for a reason. But as long as there is water, even if it's just a tear, there is hope." And with that, the Indian woman was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the sound of the wind whistling between the rocks. She stood there for a long time after the old woman left, staring at the water she barely recognized. The river, once wide and generous, was now just a scar in the earth, a reminder of what it once was. And she, who had always thought she could wait forever, began to understand that even patience has its limits. Even faith has a breaking point. But still, she didn't move. Because, deep down, as long as there was a trickle of water, as long as the river still breathed, she could keep breathing too. Keep waiting. Even if the whole world told her it was in vain. Even if silence was the only answer. And so she remained. A solitary figure at the edge of a river that refused to die completely. A woman who still believed in promises, even when everything around her seemed to be crumbling. Because in the end, the river was her only witness. And as long as it flowed, even if it was just a breath, she would not be alone. The town of Redemption Creek had always been a place where words flew faster than bullets. A murmur in the saloon at dusk could become absolute truth before sunrise the next day. And when it came to him, the cowboy who departed without warning, leaving behind a promise and a woman by the river, rumors spread like wildfire. At first, she tried to ignore them. After all, what others said didn't matter. He would return. He had to. But as the months dragged on and the river dried up, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and she could no longer pretend not to hear them. It all began with the stranger who arrived riding a skinny horse, wearing a worn-out hat, and an air of someone who'd seen too much. He stopped at the saloon, ordered a glass of whiskey, and before nightfall, was already telling stories about a cowboy he'd seen in Lincoln County. Tall, light eyes, a scar on his chin, he described, as the men around him leaned in, eager for details. They say he was with a gang of outlaws, those who are not afraid to shed blood. The words echoed like gunshots in her head as she sat in the corner, sewing a rip in her skirt, trying not to hear. But how could she not hear when the very air seemed to vibrate with the tension of those who now watched her with a mixture of pity and curiosity? She left before the stranger could finish his story. She walked quickly, as if she could escape the words that had haunted her all the way to her father's door. But it was no use. The thin walls couldn't muffle the whispers that now spread like a plague. He abandoned her. Found another one. Or worse. He's dead, and she doesn't want to accept it. The women of the town, who had previously greeted her with forced smiles, now avoided her, as if her pain were contagious. Even the children stopped playing near her, as if they knew instinctively that something dark was swirling around her. Her father, a man of few words and calloused hands, had tried to talk to her one night after the last customer had left the forge. "Daughter," he said, wiping the soot from his hands with a dirty cloth. "You can't live like this, waiting for a man who may never come back." She didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He didn't understand. No one understood. For them, it was just a matter of pride, of stubbornness. But for her, it was a matter of faith. A promise wasn't something to be broken so easily. But the rumors didn't stop. They got worse. One day, it was a story that he'd been seen in El Paso, drunk, playing cards with unnamed men. The next, it was that he was being held in Santa Fe, accused of a crime he hadn't committed. Each story was more absurd than the last. But they all had one thing in common. He wasn't coming back. And, worse, he wasn't alone. "They say he has a woman with him," whispered the merchant's wife, as she weighed flour for herself in the shop. A Mexican woman, beautiful as sin. She felt her hands tremble, but she kept her face impassive. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. Then the sheriff arrived. He wasn't a bad man, just tired. Like all those who upheld the law in lands where justice was a bargaining chip. He stopped in front of the forge, took off his hat, and scratched his head, as if unsure where to begin. "I heard things," he said, looking at his feet. "Things I don't want to believe." She crossed her arms, feeling sweat drip down her back despite the cold wind blowing. "So what?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. The sheriff sighed. "If he's involved with those men, there's nothing I can do. But you deserve to know the truth." She laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. "What truth?" he asked. "The kind of men who drink too much and make up stories? Or the kind who are afraid of a woman who refuses to give up?" The sheriff didn't answer. He just put his hat back on and left, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. That night, she didn't go to the river. She stayed in her room, staring out the window as the moon illuminated the sleeping city. She thought of all the stories she'd heard, all the glances that avoided her, all the words that cut like knives. And for the first time, she felt doubt. Not a small doubt that could be dismissed with a thought, but a deep doubt that took root in her chest like a weed. What if it was all true? What if he really had abandoned her? What if, somewhere beyond those mountains, he had already forgotten her? She stood and went to the mirror above her dresser. She stared at her own reflection, at her eyes swollen from crying, at her dry lips, at her hair that had lost its shine. Who was that woman? She no longer recognized herself. She was no longer the blacksmith's daughter, nor the cowboy's beloved. She was just a shadow, a figure waiting by a drying river while the world moved on. The next morning, she woke with a determination she hadn't felt in months. She would no longer hide. She would no longer pretend others' words didn't affect her. If they wanted to speak, let them speak. If they wanted to judge, let them judge. But she wouldn't give them the pleasure of seeing her break. He went to the saloon at noon, when he knew most of the men would be there. He walked in with his head held high, ignoring the surprised looks, and went straight to the counter. "A whiskey?" she asked, her voice firm. The saloon owner, a fat man with a nicotine-yellow mustache, looked at her as if she'd grown a second head. "Are you sure, girl?" he asked, as if she were a lost child. She just nodded. He poured the drink, and she downed it in one gulp, feeling the fire run down her throat and burn her chest. She didn't blink. She didn't cough. She just set the glass back on the bar and stared at the men around her, daring them to say something. No one spoke. They just watched her, with a mixture of respect and fear. Because in that moment, she was no longer the abandoned woman, the fragile figure waiting for a man who might never return. She was something more. She was a force of nature, as relentless as the drought devouring the river. And, for the first time in a long time, she felt she still had control over something, even if it was only herself. But when she left the saloon and returned home, the weight of loneliness settled back on her shoulders. Because in the end, it didn't matter how much she hardened herself. It didn't matter how many whiskeys she drank, or how many stares she faced. The truth was, when night fell and the wind howled between the houses, she still heard his voice. She still felt the touch of his hands. She still saw the gleam of his eyes in the moonlight. And that, more than any rumor, was what kept her awake. Because, while his memory still burned within her, there was no room for doubt, no room for giving up. Even if the whole world told her it was madness, even if the river dried up completely, even if hope was the last thing to die. The sun sank over Redemption Creek, painting the sky with fiery hues and gray, as if the horizon itself were ablaze. The air smelled of dust and despair, and the wind, which had once carried the distant murmur of the river, now carried only the echo of a silence that seemed eternal. She sat on her usual rock, her fingers digging into the dry sand, as if trying to coax from the earth some answer that time refused to provide. The river, once her refuge, was now nothing more than a scar on the landscape, a cruel reminder of all that had been lost. It was then that he heard the hoofbeats of a horse. It wasn't the quickening pace of a fleeing animal, nor the heavy tread of a weary traveler. It was something in between, an uneven rhythm, as if the rider were hesitant to approach. She didn't turn. She didn't want to see. She didn't want to know. But the sound stopped right behind her, and the smell of horse sweat and sunburned leather filled her nostrils, bringing with it a wave of memories that hit her like a punch to the gut. "You are hard to find." The voice was masculine, rough, as if sculpted by years of silence and cigarettes. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but there was something about it, a familiarity that made her shiver. She finally turned, slowly, as if afraid the movement might shatter the fragile balance of the moment. The man astride the skinny horse wasn't who she expected. It wasn't him. It wasn't the cowboy with the light eyes and the scar on his chin. He was a stranger, or almost. His face was marked by scars that weren't just from age, but from a life that had been too hard. He wore a worn hat, tilted forward, hiding half his face, and a worn leather jacket, once black but now faded by sun and rain. His eyes, however, were what held her. They were dark, deep, and there was a shadow in them she knew well, the shadow of someone who had seen too much and was no longer afraid of anything. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice firmer than she felt. The man dismounted from his horse with a slow movement, as if every bone ached. He took off his hat and held it against his chest, revealing a head of gray hair, cut close to the scalp. "My name doesn't matter," he said, his voice even huskier now that he was closer. But I met him. The man you've been waiting for. She felt her heart race, as if it wanted to escape her chest. Where is he? The question came out before she could stop it, filled with an urgency that startled her. The man stared at the dry river, as if searching for the right words on those bare stones. It's not an easy story to tell, he said finally, spitting on the floor as if to get rid of a bitter taste. She didn't answer. There was nothing to say. She just waited, her hands clasped so tightly that her nails dug into her own skin. I met him in Silver City, the man began, his voice low, as if he feared the wind would carry his words away. He was in a saloon, playing cards with the wrong men. Men who don't forgive debts or betrayals. He paused, as if measuring the weight of each syllable. He made a lot of money that night. Or lost it. It depends on how you look at it. She felt a chill. What does this mean? The man looked straight at her, and his eyes were like two bottomless wells. It means he owes more than he can pay. And men like that don't take no for an answer. She swallowed, her throat feeling as dry as a riverbed. Is he dead? The question came out as a sigh, almost inaudible. The man shook his head slowly. Not that I know of. But he's being hunted. And when men like those decide to hunt, it's only a matter of time before they find their prey. She felt her legs weaken, as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. Why did you come to tell me this? He asked, his voice trembling but still filled with a dull anger. What do you want from me? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled something from his jacket pocket. It was an envelope, crumpled, covered in dirt and stains that might have been blood. He held it out to her as if it were a peace offering. He asked me to give this to you, in case something happened. She hesitated before picking up the envelope. Her fingers trembled as she opened the broken seal, as if she feared that by doing so, she would sever the last thread connecting her to him. Inside was a letter. It wasn't long, just a few lines, written in hurried handwriting, as if scribbled in a moment of desperation. If you're reading this, it's because something went wrong. It wasn't by choice that I didn't come back. It was by fate, or by bad luck, or both. But know that, until my last breath, I thought of you. I thought of the river. I thought of the promise. And if there is justice in this world or the next, I will fulfill it. Even if it's only in your dreams. Even if it's only in the memory of what we could have been. Don't wait for me anymore. Not for me. But if one day, somewhere, you hear a horse approaching at dusk, don't look back. It could just be the wind. Or it could be me. And if it is, know that I've finally come home. She read the words once, twice, 3 times, as if by doing so she could extract some meaning from them that wasn't there. But there was nothing else. Just those lines. And the weight of a goodbye she refused to accept. When did he give you this? He asked, his voice so low it was almost lost in the wind. The man scratched his stubble, as if trying to remember. About a month ago. He was injured. Not seriously, but enough to know he couldn't escape forever. He paused. He asked me to come here. To tell you he wasn't a coward, that he wasn't a liar, that he just couldn't keep his promise. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of this man. Not in front of yet another stranger who had come to bring her news of a life that was no longer hers. And now? He asked, his voice breaking despite all his efforts. What do I do now? The man looked at the horizon, where the sun was setting in flames. I can't tell you that, he replied, putting his hat back on his head. But if I were you, I wouldn't wait around for a man who might never come back. Life is too short to be wasted on a dry riverbank. She didn't answer. She just stared at the letter in her hands, as if it could somehow bring back everything that had been lost. The man mounted his horse, adjusted the reins, and looked at her one last time. I am really sorry, he said. And this time, She believed he really felt it. Then, he turned the animal and walked away, leaving behind only the echo of hooves and the smell of dust suspended in the air. She sat there for a long time after he left, sitting on the rock, the letter clutched to her chest, as if she could feel the last trace of his warmth through the paper. The wind howled around her, and the sky, once a blanket of stars, now seemed empty, as if even the stars had grown weary of witnessing her pain. Slowly, she unfolded the letter again, and read the words for the last time. This time, however, she wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for a goodbye, because deep down, she'd always known this moment would come. She had always known that sooner or later she would have to choose between continuing to wait for a ghost or moving on, even if it meant leaving behind everything that had once been real. And as the last glimmer of sunlight faded from the horizon, she finally let the tears fall. Not for him, not for the broken promise, but for herself, for the woman she had been, for the woman she could still be, and for the river, which, even dry, still held in its stones the memory of a love that time could not erase. The sun rose over Redemption Creek like a gaping wound in the sky, red and inflamed, as if the earth itself were bleeding. She woke before dawn, as she had for months, but this time it wasn't habit that kept her from bed. It was something deeper, a restlessness that had gnawed at her since the night before, ever since the stranger had given her the letter. The paper still lay on the table beside her bed, crumpled by her hands, as if she had tried to squeeze some unwritten truth from it. His farewell words echoed in her mind, mixed with the sound of the wind beating against the wooden walls of the house. "Don't wait for me anymore." She put on the same worn cotton dress, ran her fingers through her tangled hair, and left quietly, so as not to wake her father. The city was still asleep, enveloped in a silence that seemed heavier than usual. The streets were empty except for a few dogs rummaging through the dust for scraps of food. He walked to the river, or what was left of it, barefoot, the earth warm and rough beneath his soles. The riverbed was almost completely dry now, only a few puddles of dirty water and dried mud marking the place where life used to flow. He sat on the stone, as he always had, but this time there was no comfort in that gesture. Only an emptiness that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The envelope was still in her hands, crumpled, stained with the tears she had shed the night before. She had reread the letter so many times that she had almost memorized every word, every comma, as if in doing so she might find a hidden meaning, a clue that it had all been a mistake. But the words remained the same. "It wasn't by choice that I didn't come back. Don't wait for me anymore." It was goodbye. A goodbye she had refused to accept for so long, but now it was there, black and white, like a sentence. The wind blew softly, carrying the smell of scorched earth and despair. She looked up at the sky, where the first morning stars still twinkled stubbornly before fading into the light of day. She remembered the nights they'd lain there, side by side, gazing up at the sky, while he told her stories of faraway places, of cities where the law didn't reach, and men made their own rules. He spoke, and she listened, fascinated, as if his words could transport her far from that monotonous life, to a world where anything was possible. Now, those same stars seemed cold and distant, as if they drifted away with him. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine him. Not as the wounded and hunted man the stranger had described, but as he had been before. Tall, strong, with that rare smile that lit his tired face. She tried to hear his voice, his laughter, the sound of his approaching footsteps. But all she could hear was silence, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow even her own memories. "You can't stay here forever." Her father's voice made her turn. He was standing a few steps behind her, his hands in his pockets, his face lined with worry. He wasn't a man of many words, but that morning, his eyes said everything he couldn't express. "Time's for home," he said, his voice hoarse. "This won't bring him back." She didn't answer. She knew he was right, but she also knew that if she went back now, if she gave up on this place, it would be like admitting it was all over, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I just need a little more time, she murmured, more to herself than to him. The father sighed, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. It's been too long, he replied, turning around and heading back home, leaving her alone with her ghosts. She stood there all day. The sun rose, burning her skin, and she didn't move. The hours passed, and she didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't blink. She just sat, staring at the dry riverbed, as if, through sheer willpower, she could make the water flow again. As if, through sheer stubbornness, she could turn back time. In the afternoon, when the heat was unbearable, she finally opened her eyes and looked around. The city was beginning to wake up. She heard the sound of carts, the clatter of horses, the voices of women calling their children for lunch. Everything was moving forward. Everything except her. It was then that he saw something on the ground near his feet. It was a small stone, round and smooth, like the ones he used to skip in the water when there was still water to jump in. He picked it up, feeling its cold weight in his palm, and without thinking, threw it with all his strength. The stone flew, bounced once, twice on the dry stones, and disappeared into nothingness. Like everything else. A tear ran down her face, hot and salty, and she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, like all the others, onto the dry ground. Because deep down, she knew she was nearing the end. There was no more water in the river. There was no more hope in the letter. There was nothing left but the stark truth. He wasn't coming back. But still, she didn't move. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, as if nature were somehow trying to compensate for the cruelty of those days. She looked at the horizon, where the line between earth and sky seemed to dissolve, and felt something inside her break. It wasn't pain. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, an acceptance that hurt more than anything. It was then that he heard the sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A distant clatter of noise, coming from the direction of the mountains. Her heart raced, and she jumped to her feet, eyes wide, body tense. It couldn't be. Not after everything. Not after the letter, the stranger, the months of waiting. But the sound persisted, and as it grew closer, it became clearer. It was a horse, a single horse, galloping toward him. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand firm. She wasn't going to fall apart now. Not when, after all this time, something finally seemed to be happening. The horse appeared at the top of the hill, a dark silhouette against the blazing sky. It wasn't the black horse he'd been riding. It was a chestnut, lean, its ribs exposed, as if it had traveled far and fast. And astride it wasn't the man she'd expected. It was a boy, no more than 15, his face smeared with dust and his eyes wide with fear. He stopped the animal a few feet away, panting heavily, as if he had been running for days without stopping. "Are you here?" he asked, his voice trembling. "The woman waiting for the cowboy?" She nodded, unable to speak. The boy dismounted with difficulty, pulling something out of his shirt. It was a small object, wrapped in a dirty cloth. He held it out to her with trembling hands. "He asked me to deliver this to you," he said, his voice breaking. He said it was the last promise. She took the package, feeling its light weight in her hands. She unfolded the cloth and saw what was inside. It was a ring. It wasn't valuable. Just a simple silver band with a faded blue stone. But she recognized it immediately. It was the ring he wore on his little finger, the only valuable thing he owned. "Is he?" he asked, his voice breaking. The boy shook his head. "I don't know. They took him. Bad men. He gave me this and told me to run. To find you." The boy looked back, as if he feared something, or someone was following him. I couldn't do anything else. She held the ring tightly, feeling the cool metal against her skin. It was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't an illusion. It was proof that somewhere he was still alive. Or had been, until recently. Where? She asked, her voice firmer than she felt. Where did they take him? The boy hesitated, as if afraid to say the words aloud. To the canyon, he finally replied. Devil's Canyon. They say no one leaves there alive. She didn't wait to hear anything else. She turned and began running toward her father's house, the ring clutched tightly in her hand, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst. There was no more time to wait, no more time to doubt. If he was still alive, she would find him, even if she had to go through hell to do it. Devil's Canyon was not a place for the faint of heart. The red stone walls rose like the claws of hell, cutting the sky into two unequal halves. The air was hot and heavy, heavy with the smell of sulfur and dust, as if the earth itself were rotting. She arrived at dusk, riding the boy's horse. He had been reluctant to let her go alone, but she had had no choice. Nobody comes back from there, he repeated, his eyes filled with a fear she couldn't allow to contaminate her. But she was no one. She was the woman who had waited by a dry riverbank, who had carried a promise in her chest like a sacred burden. And if he were there, if there was still a chance, she would find him. The horse advanced cautiously, its hooves echoing on the stones like the beat of a racing heart. She could hear voices in the distance, deep laughter, the sound of bottles breaking. Men. Dangerous men. The kind of men who didn't think twice about pulling the trigger. She fingered the ring in her pocket, feeling the cool metal against her fingers, a reminder that there was still something to fight for. She dismounted before reaching camp, tying it to a dry bush. She couldn't risk the animal betraying her. She advanced on foot, silent as a shadow, using the rocks for cover. The sun was setting, painting everything a bloody red, as if the sky were announcing what was to come. And then she saw it. He was tied to a post in the center of the camp, his head bowed, his body covered in blood and dust. His hat was gone, and his once dark hair was now plastered to his scalp, matted with sweat and dirt. One of the men, a giant with a red beard and a scar across his face, punched him in the stomach, and he doubled over, coughing. Still, he didn't scream. He never screamed. He was too stubborn for that. She felt something inside her break. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a pain so deep it seemed to come from beyond herself, as if her very soul were being ripped apart. But there was no time for tears. Not now. She looked around, counting the men. 5. All armed. All drunk enough to be dangerous, but not drunk enough to lose control. She had a knife in her belt and a pistol she'd stolen from the boy. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. She waited until night fell completely, until the fires were lit and the men began to laugh, passing bottles back and forth, forgetting everything but their own cruelty. Then, when the red-bearded giant walked away from the group to relieve himself behind a rock, she moved. There was no warning. There was no hesitation. She emerged from the shadows like a specter, her knife slicing into the man's throat before he could scream. His body fell without a sound, and she was already moving on the next man, her pistol firing twice, quick as lightning. The other men rose, confused, but she was already upon them, her knife glinting in the firelight, her eyes cold as ice. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't a clean fight. It was a bloodbath. And when it was over, she stood, panting, covered in blood that wasn't hers, looking at him, who was watching her with a mixture of shock and something that felt almost like reverence. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. She didn't answer. She just ran to him, cutting the ropes that bound him with trembling hands. He fell into her arms, weak but alive. Alive. That was all that mattered. "I told you not to wait," she murmured as she helped him to his feet, putting his arm around her shoulders. "And I told you I would wait," she replied, her voice breaking for the first time. "Until the river dries up. Until the world ends." He laughed, a weak, pained sound, but real. "The river dried up," he said, looking at the horizon as if he could see beyond the mountains, beyond time, and the world. "Well, the world is still here." She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if they would escape, if they would find a place where they could finally live in peace. But in that moment, as she helped him onto his horse and climbed in behind him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, she knew one thing. The promise had been fulfilled. Not in the way she had imagined, not in the way she had dreamed, but it had been fulfilled. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. And so ends the story of She Waited by the River, a cowboy's last promise. A journey of love, loss, hope, and redemption that shows us that some promises are worth keeping, even when the world seems to conspire against them. If you like this story, like this video and subscribe to the channel, don't miss out on upcoming content. We're preparing a new series of thrilling stories, full of drama, romance, and adventure that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Until then, leave a comment. Do you think they managed to live happily ever after, or did fate still have more trials in store for them? I want to know your opinion.